Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Olena Berezovska and I'm welcoming you on my YouTube channel. And today we are going to have the audio podcast, not the video one, but I'm sure you will not be disappointed because I have a special guest. A couple years ago, I was wandering on Instagram and checking some new accounts, and I found one under intriguing name, Embryo Man. So I started following this account, and I wasn't disappointed because it was the account of professional embryologists. It was about embryos, implantation, different tests. Embryology is a part of reproductive medicine that is invisible for patients, because usually when people have some problems with conceiving the child, they go into a reproductologist who treats infertility. But embryologists are very important when it comes to IVF. So today my guest is embryologist. Sean, you are becoming a very popular blogger that tells the truth about embryos, eggs, IVFs, endometrium, the truths that usually are behind the curtain of reproductive medicine. This specialty of medicine, including embryology, is growing rapidly. What do you think are the most positive good news we have about reproductive medicine today?
Hi. I started this whole Embryo Man thing back in 2018. So I was an embryologist at the time, and I noticed a gap online regarding evidence-based sources for information for IVF. So I thought it would be a good thing for me not only to educate myself to become a better embryologist, but to also help educate others, which is a passion of mine. So I launched from Embryo toward the end of 2018, and I started with summarizing evidence about embryo grading. Embryo Man came shortly afterward as a handle I was using on social media, and also as a way for me to keep anonymous, because I wasn't sure if what I was doing would be approved by my job, which I actually left in 2020 when COVID started. But since then, I still keep on with Embryo and Embryo Man, and I try to answer people's questions about IVF using evidence-based sources. These days, though, I act more as a journalist, and Embryo is more like an IVF news site. However, with my day job, I'm not always able to fully report on, all the news that's available each week, because there is quite a bit. Well, a lot of what I do, maybe not so much these days, but is help people with their questions about IVF. And over the years, I've noticed that there's fewer people trying to be anonymous about it. So I think people are becoming more comfortable with the idea of infertility and accepting that this is a medical condition and there's no shame in that. There are certainly a lot more influencers on social media these days than there were 4 years ago, and I think that's helping to get all that out there. Keeping these conversations going and being open about it will only do good in removing the stigma that's around it, and I think that's a really positive thing.
And where did we stop and barely move, and why? By the way, now a lot of people are talking about pre-implantation genetic testing. So can you tell more about this?
I think there's a continued push to market medications or techniques that are based on little evidence. PGTA or PGS testing, it's a really good example of this. So it starts off with a really great idea. The fact that live birth rates in IVF decrease with age, while the chance of having an aneuploid embryo, that's an embryo that doesn't have the right number of chromosomes, increases. Let's create this technology that assesses if an embryo is aneuploid and only transfer the embryos that are euploid, the ones that have the right number of chromosomes. So that sounds great, but it doesn't really work. Euploid embryos still fail, and clinical trials that have investigated PGTA don't show a benefit in women who use euploid embryos over using an embryo that has just a good grade, especially in younger women. Yet it still gets pushed on patients as this almost necessary thing that they need to do because PGTA will improve their chances. All PGTA is doing is selecting the best embryo to transfer. And if studies are showing that this is no different from conventional embryo grading, then I think that's a problem. It doesn't even end with PGTA. There's so many different IVF add-ons available. So now a lot of people are talking about the ERA, which is supposed to help define when the window of implantation is. But this isn't being very well supported by the research either, and yet it's still promoted as this necessary thing. And if it isn't by their doctors, then it's from people on social media who claim that, this and that worked for me, so you should try it too. Which is, okay, but I think people should be aware that when you take these things and you test them in studies on hundreds of women and they don't work, the treatment may not actually be effective. So I think the industry needs to be better regulated, to put priority on researching these treatments, to show that they're safe and to show that they're working before they can be used by the public. Because potentially it's wasting a lot of people's time and money, and it may not even work.
The definition of the quality of embryos still does not have a clear classification and depends on the experience of embryologists. From your point of view, if you had the opportunity to change something in the classification, what would you change?
Yeah, so I'd encourage everyone to start using a standardized way of grading. Many clinics use these modified systems, like clinic-specific systems for grading, and it's so confusing. Recently, I had one person ask me about this grade, and it was the most bizarre thing I ever saw. I had no idea, just really no clue. Occasionally I'll help people convert their strange clinic grades to the standard grading, but this one was just so out of left field. I had no clue how they were doing it. So I think that's a problem. And I think this would no longer be a problem if grading was more standardized. I also think that the future of grading is artificial intelligence. So there's new technology that uses time-lapse data that can even determine if an embryo is euploid or not, with high agreement with PGTA, without even doing a biopsy. So in the future, there may not be any grading at all, only scores that are assigned by a computer, which I think will be much more consistent. Grading is super subjective and is limited by the single snapshot of the embryo. There's a lot of other clues in an embryo's quality that are only revealed by time-lapse, and I think that's where we're going to end up going with that.
So we know embryos cannot be improved, and therefore the truth of life is on the sideline. At the same time, we know that the success of IVF mostly depends on the quality of embryos. But nevertheless, doctors constantly treat the endometrium, and women are constantly taking some medication. In what cases we are talking about bad endometrium? Can we change it, and can we make it good one?
So women with a bad endometrium can be those with endometritis or anatomical abnormalities like polyps or fibroids. These things can have an impact on the endometrium. Even endometriosis, which is a diagnosis that's commonly attributed to having effects on egg quality. But recent evidence found that there was no difference in endometriosis patients who transferred their own eggs compared to donor eggs. So this suggests that endometriosis is more involved in decreasing the quality of the endometrium compared to egg quality. I got to look more at that study though. I didn't read it in its entirety yet. Things like receptivity and identifying the right time to transfer an embryo is something that sounds great, but when you put it to the test in clinical trials, with the ERA, it hasn't performed so well. And of course, all the immunological treatments that are used to optimize the endometrium seem to be based on low quality evidence. So I recently reviewed a study that reviewed a number of immunological therapies that are used in IVF, like aspirin, heparin, intralipids, and a bunch of others. And they didn't find a benefit in using these treatments compared to controls. They mostly looked at women with a history of implantation failure or women with a good prognosis. And they didn't really have many studies that involved women with actual autoimmune disorders. Now, there's clinics out there that will just treat women with all of these immune regulating drugs, and they may not actually have the background that would benefit from this. It's very possible that there are groups of women out there, like people with autoimmune disorders or those who have had pregnancy losses, and maybe these women would benefit from these treatments. But there just isn't enough data, enough studies out there that are looking at these sorts of things. So the widespread use of these immunotherapies in some clinics may not be appropriate. In fact, several associations, including the ASRM, don't even recommend their use because of a lack of evidence. So I think it's a problem.
The history of IVF has gone through the transfer of several embryos to one. Now they are talking about transferring more than one embryo. Are there any pitfalls in this in addition to those that we already know and have learned well?
So I think transferring one is usually best. I tend to get behind what is recommended by the ASRM, and they'll usually recommend to transfer one in most cases, except in situations of advanced age, or in women who have had multiple failed transfers. Then they might recommend more than one embryo. The risk, of course, with a double embryo transfer is that you can have twins, which are associated with an increased risk of complications for both the mother and for the babies. Babies born from twin pregnancies tend to be born earlier and with lower birth weights. I think there's this misconception that transferring two embryos improves outcomes. A recent study where either one or two embryos are transferred in women under 35 found that a double embryo transfer improved live birth rates from about 52% to 61%, but it increased the chance of getting twins from about 3% to 60%. So, there's this slight increase in live birth rates with a double embryo transfer, but there's this dramatic increase in the chance of multiples. And another study compared single and double embryo transfers, again in women under 35, and women who transferred one embryo, and if this failed, they did a second single embryo transfer. These women had a cumulative live birth rate of almost 70%. This is compared to a live birth rate of about 58% with just doing the double embryo transfer. So in this study, doing two separate single embryo transfers had a higher chance of a live birth compared to a single double embryo transfer. So transferring one, usually, based on this, it's not only the best choice in terms of keeping both the mother and babies healthy, but it might also be the best choice in improving success rates.
Pre-implantation genetic testing is an expensive method, and at the same time it can be recommended for women over 35 years of age. And here too data appeared that not all age women need this test. What is your opinion about this test? Are there new technologies for genetic testing of embryos?
Yeah, so based on what I've seen from clinical trials, there doesn't seem to be a benefit for PGTA for women less than 37 with a good prognosis compared to conventional embryo grading. So remember, PGTA is only selecting the best embryo from a batch. It isn't making embryos better than they already are. Embryo grading is essentially doing the same thing. It picks the embryo with the best potential. But I think the way that it's marketed to a lot of people, they tend to forget this when they're doing PGTA. However, there does seem to be an advantage for older women over conventional grading. But I think it's really important for people to think hard about what they will do if they test all their embryos and have aneuploids. Because in some cases, people will go ahead and transfer these embryos, and these really don't. There really is no recommendation to do this. And so if people are willing to transfer these embryos, maybe it's better that they don't do PGTA. So I think PGTA can be useful for older women who have a lot of embryos, or for people with single gene mutations, as in PGTM or PGD. They may want to see if their embryos are affected or not by a condition. But I don't think blindly testing embryos using PGTA for everyone is helping. It takes what's an already super expensive set of treatments with IVF and adds thousands of dollars on top of it. Even poor people want to do IVF, and I don't think it's fair when PGTA is being pushed on them as some kind of necessary treatment that's comparable, just to simple grading of an embryo in some cases.
What drugs and non-drugs can negatively affect the implantation of the embryo? How to avoid the pressure of doctors and other people who recommend taking heavy drugs, vitamins, dietary supplements, and hormones?
So my only comment here is that as long as there's good scientific evidence for a treatment to improve IVF outcomes and it's safe, then I'm all for it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff out there that isn't based on strong science, and people want to have choices if things aren't working out, which is understandable, but I don't think people realize that a lot of these add-ons aren't as effective as they think they are. And this is part of what I'm trying to do with my website, Embryo, by bringing light to all of the evidence around these treatments so people can understand the current state of things and make informed decisions. Some doctors, unfortunately, don't have the time to do research on all of these different treatments, so they may not be aware of some of these things. So I'm really trying to get more exposure for Embryo because I think it's important, but it's difficult to do all the writing myself. So I'm hoping that whoever is listening right now can jump on over to remembryo.com or just search for Embryo Man. You'll find me that way too, and sign up to support me. It's $10 a month. This will help me, get the funding that I need to hire writers to eventually get all this information out there. There's dozens of studies each week that I'd love to report on, but I can't because I simply don't have the time. And I really think people need to be aware of this research.
Sean, thank you very much for this wonderful, interesting conversation, and I'm sure many people like it.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for having me.
I hope I'll see you next time and we can discuss some other questions. Bye, everyone.